For those of you who are just logging in, welcome. We have a poll going, so we ask you to take a few minutes and complete those 2 questions. Welcome to today's webinar, Using Data to Support Resident Outcomes. This is the first webinar in a 2-part series that is focusing on outcomes measurement, looking at how data is valuable both internally and externally for resident services practitioners. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Alexandra Nassau-Brownstone. I'm Director of Resident Outcomes and CORES, Certified Organization for Resident Engagement and Services at the Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, otherwise known as SAFE. I'm also joined by my colleague, Nicole Manchester, who is Data and Analytics Manager for SAFE. I'm going to take a minute on a few housekeeping items. Due to the number of people we expect on today's call, we have all of the lines muted. If you have a question, please feel free to use the chat box. There's also the questions box. My colleague Sarah is going to be trying to monitor those. We're also planning to leave some time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that have come up either in the chat or the Q&A, and we may be able to unmute folks too if there's some more complicated questions that we want to engage on at that point. The webinar is being recorded. We plan to make it available on the CORES Resource Library. In addition, a copy of the slides is available in the chat, and we'll be making copies of the slides available following the presentation. So at this point, I know people are still logging in, but maybe we should close the first poll and just get a sense of folks, their responses on their comfort with or their use of data systems and the size of their portfolio. So it looks like we've got kind of a range of different size organizations, with some of you all on the smaller end, mid-range, and larger portfolios. And there's quite a few of you who are not currently using a data system, but are thinking about it and evaluating options. We've got some folks using AASCOnline, Family Metrics, Salesforce, Success Measures, and a number of you that use some other form of system. So a range of different levels of familiarity. That's terrific. Thank you. All right, we can probably stop sharing the results. Okay. So, SAFE is a collaborative of 13 of the largest nonprofit affordable housing developers across the country. Our members own and operate over 147,000 rental homes, serving over 259,000 people. In addition to being committed to preserving and expanding affordable housing options, SAFE members are also committed to deploying resident services or service-enriched housing across their portfolio. For those of you who aren't familiar with SAFE, we have a number of initiatives, including our national policy work, energy and water initiatives, health and housing, our resident outcomes initiative, and the CORES certification, which builds on many of the best practices found across the other bodies of our work. SAFE has led an outcomes initiative for our members for nearly 7 years, with a goal of capturing and demonstrating the value and impact of resident services at a national level. We believe that housing is fundamentally a platform for greater resident stability and economic mobility. And today's presentation is going to focus on what we've learned in those years about data collection, privacy concerns, storage, ways to think about the value and analysis of resident outcomes data. We're not going to focus on any particular data system in this session, but we will provide some higher level learning we've gained over the past years about the use of data to inform resident services programming and how to engage with residents about it. SAFE had a number of goals with the launch of our outcomes initiatives: to establish a common language, understanding, and standards for the field, to support internal operations, and to help communicate them with external stakeholders such as funders and investors, partners, including in the healthcare and education sectors, and to engage with policymakers and regulators. In addition, we aim to leverage the impact of service-enriched housing to identify new opportunities for funding this work that can be sustainable and replicable. The Outcomes Initiative among the SAFE members collects common outcomes measures in 5 key impact areas: work, income, and assets, housing stability, education, community engagement, and health and wellness. A framework of these measures can be found on both SAFE's website and the CORES resource library. All of the organizations that participate in our outcomes collection also participate in their own data collection, and they select their own indicators that are valuable for their own operations. But as a part of the broader SAFE Outcomes initiative, they've worked together to align some of the key measures across the organizations so we can collect and analyze data at a much larger scale, building on the anecdotal successes we've all seen and heard to a system of more consistent measurement that is both resident-centered and data-driven. And so as we're going through the slides and through the presentation, we'll also be sharing a number of these resources in the chat, so you can find a link to some of those measures that Sarah has shared in the chat. About 5 years ago, SAFE formed a community of practice to support a system of enhanced resident services coordination, which brought together SAFE members and other practitioners across the affordable housing and resident services fields. We focused on laying out the fundamental key decisions, functions, and capacities that are needed to support a robust system of resident services coordination. It's not just about the individual working at the property. They're critical for success, but it also includes all the functions and infrastructure needed to support resident services at a property and across a portfolio. This includes not just committed, capable staff, but it also includes the technology system, the programs and partnerships, the organizational relationships and knowledge, the formalized processes and systems of accountability, the use of community-level data and resident data to understand impact, and how an organization integrates its commitment and investment in resident services with the other business operations and functions. And that work led to the development of this framework, a framework for a system of resident services coordination. It was born out of that work. It's also the foundation for the CORES certification. And it's essentially a decision-making framework that articulates an approach to how resident services often functions in an organization, integrating resident services in the development process and in the management of the property and with asset management. The steps articulated in it demonstrate how organizations are thinking about data collection, its practical use in informing resident engagement and programming, and how organizations are using data collection to understand their own success and impact, and to inform the evolution of their work over time. So as I mentioned, the framework is very much foundational to the creation of the CORES certification. CORES launched in 2018 as a certification that recognizes owners and third-party providers at a sponsor or an organizational level that have developed a robust commitment, capacity, and competency in providing resident services coordination in affordable rental homes. Data collection and the use of data to inform and help drive strategic decision-making is a significant part of the capacity that CORES looks for and recognizes in organizations. So we're really pleased to be offering this two-part webinar series to help organizations get more familiar with outcomes and some of the best practices, or brush up if they've been doing this work for a while and are perhaps looking to think about integrating new programs, new approaches, new best practices. So at this point, I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to my colleague Nicole, who's going to walk through some of the fundamentals around data and data collection, and walk through some key considerations that organizations are faced with as they commit to this work.
Great, thank you, Alexandra. So again, my name is Nicole Manchester. I'm the Data and Analytics Manager for SAFE. So excited to be talking with you all. Just briefly, just so you all know, my 3-year-old is here home with me today, and so if you hear some high-pitched squealing in the background, that is him. So I apologize in advance if that's disruptive. So basically, starting out, why do we need to collect data? This is kind of a basic slide, but basically moving from anecdotes and assumptions about who we're serving, who's living in our properties, to having more reliable information and actionable information. So moving from, thinking that about half of the residents are seniors, and, I've heard that they like craft nights, so let's do that, every once in a while, to more concrete information that, I know about 2/3, I know specifically that 2/3 of my residents are seniors, and maybe I did a survey and, 40% of them said that they wanted more physical fitness activities. So this is just one example. Next slide. So when we're thinking about data and thinking about good data practice, there's a general cycle that I think that this takes shape in. And this is somewhat similar to the CORES cycle as well, but this is specifically around data, and it's can be applicable to any kind of organization that's working with data, not just housing organizations. But a good place to start is data planning. So kind of scoping out, a general plan before you get started. What kind of data do I need now? What do I think I might need a few years from now? At what level, at what time frame, how often do I need to collect data? And then the actual data collection, thinking about the best methods for getting that data. Data quality, and some people call that QA or quality assurance. How do I ensure that the data is accurate? Data reporting, how do I get the data back out of, a data system, or how do I aggregate it in some way? And then the last piece, data storytelling, which is really, it's a complicated term, but it just means communicating a message or telling a story about the data. And so I think when people think about the cycle of data, people tend to focus on the data collection and the data reporting, and sometimes not give as much thought to the planning piece at the start, and also the data quality piece. And then lastly, data storytelling too is very important as well. So thinking about all of those pieces. Go to the next slide. So some questions that your organization should think about, whether they're starting the process of collecting more data, or is thinking about a refresh, and maybe in the process of some strategic planning. So what data do I need now? What data might I need in the future? Who needs this data? Are you going to be reporting to funders or partners? Staff within the organization might be interested in some of the data, or residents might be interested in seeing some of it as well. How am I going to gather and store this data? Do I have enough data that I need to start thinking about getting a database? What kind do I might need? How often do I need to collect this data? Annual, monthly, quarterly, something like that. How am I going to think about checking the accuracy and integrity of the data? What's the process going to be for that? And then, are there any security or privacy concerns related to this data? Particularly when we're thinking about resident-specific data, it comes with it some concerns around making sure that you're ensuring the security and privacy of the data as well. Next slide. So when we think about the kinds of data that we're talking about, this webinar is mostly around resident data, as opposed to asset management data, or other kinds of data that a housing organization might collect. But there's a lot of different ways that we can think about looking at resident data. One big category would be the resident opportunities and needs assessment. That's a part of the CORES, one component of the CORES certification. But this could include resident surveys or one-on-one interviews. It could include health assessments. It could include data that you're getting from property management systems like a Yardi or RealPage, financial elements or demographic components that you're able to pull from that system. Could include focus groups or resident meetings that you're able to kind of categorize and code to get information across properties from those. Could also include partner data. If you have a partner that's coming and doing services and collecting its own data, you might be able to create a data sharing agreement with that organization to maximize that relationship. Or could include administrative data if you're able to work with a school district, for example, and set up a data sharing agreement with them and get that sort of data. And so another bucket of data that we think about is community-wide data, which is helpful to understand the context of the neighborhood in which your properties are located, identifying partners and resources, and then also data that can give a good benchmark for your resident data to put it into context and understand kind of how your residents fare against or you know, look like compared to the broader community. Next slide. And so going back to the cycle for the CORES certification, there are a number of key documents required for CORES that can demonstrate an organization's collection and use of data. This is just a number of them, such as doing the resident needs and opportunities assessment, which can inform the property services plan, which then can get rolled up into a resident indicators and analysis report. And then that can inform, if you're looking at multiple properties, can inform this impact analysis report. So those are just a few kind of key examples. There's also a short video available on the CORES website that walks through some of these key documents as well. It's in the resource library in the CORES website. Next slide.
I think we're going to do a quick poll.
Oh, sorry.
That we're going to launch right now. No, that's fine. We wanted to hear from you all a little bit about what methods and sources you're using to collect data currently. I think there's two questions. The first one is a multiple choice, and then how you're currently using community level data. We'll give everyone a minute to complete that. Give it another 30, 20 seconds. All right, why don't we close it? All right. So the winner still is hard copy surveys, but all over the board. Some are using online, a lot of interviews, a lot of use of compliance, property management compliance data. And how are you currently using community level data? Using it periodically to inform strategic planning and program design, the leader. But across the board, there's some of you who are not currently using community level data at this point. Some and quite a few still using it early in the design process, development process, but not using it in a formalized way later. Great. Thank you, very helpful.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for doing that. It's very interesting. And so thinking more about the types of data that we're talking about, the types of resident data, these are some categories for how you might think about resident data. And this might be kind of old hat to some of you. It might be new to some of you, but just as a refresher, some buckets would be actually starting from the bottom and moving our way up. Some process measures or activities you might want to track. So this is also called inputs. So it could be information about the program or service that's being delivered across your property or properties. So the number of sessions offered, number of program participants. It could be something more broader about the number of service coordinator hours, number of service coordinators you have, something like that. And then the next step up from that is outputs or more short-term intermediate measures, which is really thinking about kind of the short-term output or impact you might see from the program or service. So this could be something really basic, like just the number of kids who participated in the program or number of adults, or it could be something one more step further than that. There might be like if you're doing financial coaching, for example, or financial counseling, it could be the percentage of residents that a service coordinator helped open a checking or savings account. It could be the number of referrals that the service coordinator was able to make to outside partners, something like that. And then the last step is looking at outcome measures and looking at more long-term impacts and hopefully improvements in quality of life, such as physical and mental health, emotional well-being, economic advancement, social connectivity, particularly for seniors, etc. For example, again, with the financial coaching example, it could be the percentage of residents that increased their savings after a year, or gained employment, or something like that. And so all of these steps are really important. It's not, we're not saying that you should only collect outcomes measures or you should only collect activities. Like, each one of them is important to see how the program is progressing over time and how one step leads to the next, and the whole cycle, basically. Next slide. And so how the data pieces all link together could be called a theory of change. It's also called a logic model. We have a number of examples of various organizations' theory of change that you can find in the CORES library. So this is an example that a SAFE member, Preservation of Affordable Housing, POA, has let us share. And so this is how they think about how the inputs or activities they're doing is leading to certain outcomes for their residents. So the inputs that they have are providing safe, healthy, affordable housing, having high quality property management, community impact coordination, which is what they call their resident services program, and then strategic partnerships and programs will lead to, in a more short-term way, housing stability, which is the fundamental piece of this, stable property operations for POA, and then kind of the immediate outputs of making referrals, providing assistance, coaching, and leading events. And then they anticipate that in a long-term way, the positive outcomes we'll see will be more positive exits or move-outs from their housing, improved quality of life, improved life outcomes for youth and family, and then helping seniors be able to age in place. So this is how they've formulated the outcomes they expect to see from the programs and services that they're offering. Next slide. I think there's sometimes a bit of a delay in the slide turner. There you go. And so moving on to the next step, so that's kind of data collection and data planning. And so the next step we're thinking about data quality, or could be called quality assurance. Different organizations call it different things. But the main pieces of this, thinking about data quality or accuracy, data completeness, or checking for missing values or incompleted data, and then data structure, how it all interconnects, whether that's in Excel files or in a data system, just thinking about how it relates and how it's being stored. And I thought this was a funny Dilbert cartoon. It occurred to me that, the 20-somethings on the call may not have even ever seen Dilbert. I feel like I'm aging myself by including this cartoon, but, this is an example of, not being able to do much with a data system or a database that has bad data in it. And so the phrase "junk in, junked out." If I could put, a slogan over my computer, this is what I would pick, because you can do the fanciest, you can have the, world's best data analyst, data scientist in your organization, and pay them a lot of money, but it doesn't, the analysis they produce isn't going to mean anything if the inputs are inaccurate, if you have fundamental problems with the way the data is being entered into your, if you have a database into your data system. Thank you. So there's some trade-offs with this, with collecting this data. I think, we don't want to give the impression that that more data is always better, that you should just collect tons and tons of data, because there are inherent trade-offs, and how you think about this is important for planning. So the first trade-off being, you could have tons of rich, great data, but that's a big burden on your staff to both collect it and then also on the quality assurance side to verify that it's accurate. So that's, you know, time that is taken away from other activities they could be doing. And then also thinking about data accuracy, you could have the most accurate data in the world, but it's easier to do that when you limit who is accessing the database. The more people you give access to the data to be able to change it and add to it, the more you run into the risk of it not being quite as accurate. You know, you get people that have differing opinions on different, you know, data points, or, you know, changing things over time. And so that's, you know, kind of a trade-off that you have to figure out within your organization of where you want to be on that spectrum. Next slide. So kind of what I was just saying, you know, thinking about how to be really strategic in the data points that you're interested in collecting, that, you know, more data is not always necessarily a good thing, depending on your organization and your organizational goals. So trying to think about a logic model or theory of change, even if it's you know, broad or you know, can be adapted over time. But try to think about that and then try to stick with it to the extent you can. You know, what outputs or outcomes do we actually expect will be produced by the work that is happening in our properties, either the programs or services, or you know, what our staff is undertaking. And then another piece of this might be considering alternative sources of data you might be able to get. So perhaps that might be data that your partner organizations are collecting that you might be able to utilize. You know, could be administrative data perhaps. And then also this property management data is a huge wealth of data that you already have to, you know, your organization already has to collect, that then you don't have to duplicate that data collection effort. Next slide. I think I'm going to hand it back over to Alexandra here.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. So Nicole talked a lot about the different types of data and some of the trade-off considerations and a bit about the value of the data in our own operations and practice. But there are also significant ethical considerations that need to be taken into account when collecting personal data from people. There's a growing awareness and recognition that residents should not be required or expected to provide very personal information about their lives and their wellness just because they live in subsidized housing. Residents of affordable housing are as entitled to privacy as residents of market rate housing or should be. Even though our intention may be good and the value of the data may feel justified to aid us in our work and to support families and seniors in maintaining stable housing and in increasing access to a variety of opportunities and supports, it can still be invasive and extractive. So in an effort to balance both our desire to be really supportive and to help support families and seniors, we wanted to provide a number of considerations. Some of these might include, how are you including the resident voice and participation in the cycle of data collection? Are residents included in the process for determining the types of survey questions or the data itself that's being collected? As Nicole started to talk about, we don't have to necessarily, we're not recommending collecting all the data. There's an opportunity to minimize the amount that you're collecting, to truly consider the value and the utility of that data. Are you and how are you going to use that data operationally? How is it really going to be useful to you strategically and to the programmatic changes you're going to make or the partnerships that you're developing? You should be considering the processes for data security. Increasingly, this is a major concern as more and more data gets stored electronically and collected electronically. How are you protecting resident privacy? How are you communicating with residents about these protections? Are you obtaining consent to share data if you have a partnership that you may be doing some sort of data sharing agreement or possibly sharing data with funders. And once the data is collected, is there an opportunity to share back some form of aggregated data with residents in supportive ways? Is there information that could be valuable or interesting for residents to have? It's important to note that there are a number of very specific trainings out there across the affordable housing and service fields that explore some of these ethical considerations around data collection. There are a number that the American Association of Service Coordinators, AASC, offers that are specifically geared towards frontline staff. So if you haven't checked those out, I encourage you to do so. We also wanted to share these Fair Information Practice Principles, FIPS. These are a set of internationally recognized practices for addressing the privacy of information about individuals. We see these as a set of best practices that can be used to guide some of the decision-making in our field. We're not going to go through each one of them, but you can see that these touch on many of the learnings and themes that we've already talked about a bit today. Creating opportunities for engaging residents in the process of collecting and using data. Being specific in why we collect certain data points. Limiting the amount of data that's collected, making a commitment to data quality and security, and holding ourselves or our own organizations accountable to these principles. And one place to look for lessons is to draw from participatory action research models. This is a collaborative approach to research that involves all stakeholders throughout the research process, from establishing the questions, to developing the data collection tools, to the analysis and dissemination of the findings. This includes, again, many of the principles we've already highlighted, engaging directly with residents and doing so collaboratively, asking them if these are the right questions, and is it the right way to ask these questions? Ask what we're missing and what they think is important for us to know. It could include different forms of resident involvement in the administration of a survey or the data collection process. There may be opportunities for recruiting or hiring resident survey ambassadors who could help build awareness of the survey and in some cases could actually administer the survey to fellow residents, depending very much on what types of data are going to be collected. And we've heard that that one of the hardest challenges for many practitioners is finding opportunities for engaging with residents about the data after it's been collected and aggregated. But thinking about, are there opportunities for residents to be included in that analysis or that interpretation of the data results? It's really it transforms the data collection process to be a little less extractive and creates a more collaborative form of engagement. And it may also provide opportunities for learning and better understanding of the data. So there's really no one-size-fits-all approach for collecting and sharing data back with residents, but we've pulled together a few suggested practices that we picked up from participatory research and from asset mapping toolkits that we see and we've heard from practitioners as being valuable and applicable. As I'm going through these, I would love to invite all of you who are listening in today, use the chat. If any of you have had some experience in sharing and engaging with residents differently about the data once it's been collected, please share it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. But a couple of suggested practices. You should be considering a variety of formats. This one shouldn't be surprising. People consume information differently. People like choice. People learn and absorb information differently. And so if there's a possibility of presenting data or learnings in a variety of formats, this encourages more people to engage with the information. And of course, with more and more happening virtually, and especially in the last 6 more months now, there may be creative opportunities to engage differently through a variety of platforms and mediums. We should be thinking about how to distill some of the information, highlight a few key points to try to identify what might be the most interesting or valuable for residents. Should be identifying assets and strengths. Our survey tools often focus on resident deficits and needs in the community because we're trying to help address them. But that can be challenging when you're trying to connect with residents, to share back that information and look for opportunities to engage differently. Look for opportunities to highlight the strengths in the community, assets, the successes that have emerged anecdotally and in the data itself. Try to frame a dialogue and have a conversation. Don't just report information back at people. Ask questions. try to create a format and a structure that creates an opportunity for engagement and discussion and reflection. And we have a couple of links highlighted here for some additional toolkits around participatory action and engagement. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole, who's going to look at some examples of data analysis and some other opportunities for benchmarking data as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just real quick, we saw that there was a question in the Q&A from someone who said that they come from the communication side of their organization and are interested in what kinds of data asset management might be collecting. And so when I was talking before, I was thinking more about property management data. My understanding of asset management data is a little bit more about the financial health of the property itself. So I'm not quite as familiar with that, those databases that they might be using. But thinking about property management data that might be collected, is collected through the certification or recertification process. So that would include things like demographics, tenant age, race, disability status, number of people in the household, and it would also include like some financial elements like employment status, household income, household assets, and then housing tenancy information. So like duration of residence, move out information, why households moved out. So that might be some key data elements that, if whoever in your organization is responsible for pulling reports out of your property management system, you might be able to get some of those data pieces, and you just want to kind of work with them to understand what time period you'd be looking for and what level of information and whatnot. So I hope that answers that question there. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about the next step in the cycle where you have all of this data that you've collected, and how do you start to think about analyzing it? So I thought this cartoon was funny. We have, a ton of data, and then we're going to shove it in a file somewhere and forget about it. So thinking about, collecting data that you're going to use, and then actually using and reporting and analyzing the data that you do collect. So that's the relationship there. Next slide. So the element of storytelling. So I think when people hear the idea of data storytelling, it sounds a little intimidating. When I think of it more about, communicating a message, or at a very basic level, thinking about how you can take the statistics or the, percentages or whatnot and putting it in a sentence. So you have this number that 60% of your residents have a bank account. Okay, what does that mean? Is that high? Is it low? Is it good? Is that, I don't know. So thinking about how do you compare it? Can you compare it to other properties? Are these other properties similar enough to the property that the 60% is coming from to be a fair benchmark? Can you look at the same property over time? Has it gone up or down over time? Can you slice it by groups of people within that property? Is that 60% really 80% for seniors and 20% for families? Are there large disparities within your properties? And then lastly, thinking about how to compare it to the neighborhood or the city or region in which your properties are located. Since there's lots of variations, the location where you're operating has a large role in the day-to-day experiences of your residents. Next slide. So this is an example of some community data that you can utilize. Enterprise Community Partners developed this index Opportunity 360 a few years ago, and they've really expanded it over the last few years, and it's a real wealth of information. And it's just a great resource for understanding kind of the broader landscape within the within certain neighborhoods. I believe they do it at the census tract level. So you can really drill down to small levels, and they have these 5 categories, and they give a rating or an index score for each category, for each neighborhood across the country. You can go in and type in your city and drill down, or I think even your address. And so it's looking at the opportunity level of education in that neighborhood, of health and well-being, economic security, mobility or transportation. And you can get this nice report that it generates that gives you lots of details about your neighborhood. So, you might pull up this report and see, for example, for this neighborhood, economic security is really high. There's high household income, high unemployment rates. So there might be a lot of good job opportunities, but a low mobility score. Maybe this is, a place out in the suburbs that there's not a lot of transit. So this might be, thinking about your property, I got to think about, mobility, transportation issues for this property, perhaps. Next slide. Another example here that we love is the 500 Cities project. This is a collaboration between the CDC and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that has health data that's available at the 500 largest cities across the U.S. It's a great tool because you can look up specific cities, or you can also download the data as well. So if, let's say, you are an organization that's thinking a lot about health data, maybe you have a large number of seniors in your properties and you're thinking about, helping them with, chronic conditions or whatnot. And, perhaps you have a high number of residents that might have diabetes, and you're trying to figure out whether, what it looks like in comparison with the neighborhood in which you're located. So that would be an example of a data point that you could get from this 500 Cities website. Next slide. And so, like I just said, you can drill down into specific cities. So the map on the left there is Baton Rouge, and you can see they've highlighted the area by the prevalence. This is the example here is percentage of residents with diabetes. So the darker shading is a higher rate of higher prevalence. And then you can also download the full data as well. Like if you have lots of properties in different parts of the country. And I should also say that this 500 Cities project started a few years ago, but there's also the city health dashboards that I believe is related to this, also funded by the CDC, that also has a wealth of information as well. So that's another health resource, and I can put it into the chat at some point as well. I think, Sarah, you probably have it somewhere too. So, thinking about, and Rose said I'm probably talking too much here. But thinking about how to connect this data to your property data, these are just some purely hypothetical scenarios here of how you might think about comparing your properties. So the chart on the left, thinking about, let's say you have 3 properties and you want to think about the percentage of, you collect data on what percentage of residents have a bank account, and you want to know how it compares to the neighborhood where they're located. So you'll see in 2 of your properties, one in Raleigh, one in South Side of Chicago, the rate is lower than the broader neighborhood, but then in one of your properties is higher than the surrounding neighborhood. So this is a good example for when you feel like your properties the residents are somewhat similar to the surrounding neighborhood, like it's, roughly comparable. It's a good benchmark. But you could also think about comparing certain segments of your residents to similar populations. So let's say you want to compare the percentage of bank residents to low-income seniors across the U.S. So you could have the chart on the right here is comparing your seniors to all low-income seniors, and then comparing your working age adults to all low-income working age adults. So we found that generally you have to one or the other approach. It's hard to find data on small geographic levels, so like a census tract or neighborhood level, and it's also for certain populations. So if you wanted to only look at, low-income residents in the neighborhoods in which you're located, it's going to be really hard to find that information because the sample sizes just get too small and it becomes unreliable. It's kind of one or the other. Next slide. And these are some examples of data that we found over the years that we found helpful. That a lot of this you can download the data or request it. Policy Math at the very bottom is a great resource as well. It does cost some money, but if you're interested in really getting a wealth of data, it's a great tool as well. Okay, so then what you probably all came here for, talking about data storage and databases. So thinking about, am I in a place in my organization where I have to start thinking about getting a data storage system? And I thought the cartoon on the right was funny here. Sometimes we don't know what's in our data system until we actually start to dig into it. So thinking about how many data points do we need? Do we have certain reporting levels? Like maybe we have to report for standards for success for HUD. What can we realistically afford is a key piece of this. And then also thinking about moving into the future, not just what do we need now, what might we need a few years from now, 5 to 10 years from now. Next slide. So we developed a longer memo that talks about some of these issues and drills down into the specific common data systems or databases that we have found based on CORES applicants, based on what we've learned from CORES applicants and what we've learned from talking with the SAFE members, and just our general understanding of the broader affordable housing field, some common resident data systems that folks use. And so there's much more information in the longer memo that we encourage you to look at. But this is just a brief snapshot of what we found. I should say we're definitely not endorsing any one of these products. Different organizations have different needs and different budgets and different portfolio sizes, and that's going to have a large impact on what system that you want to use. But just some common ones here, ETO and Apricot, both systems from Social Solutions, AASCOnline, and Family Metrics are very popular systems from the Pangea Foundation. Salesforce is a newer system that's being used that was started out in more of the for-profit space, but is being adapted for more nonprofit use. Success Measures is a product from NeighborWorks that has a wealth of evaluation and assessments in it. And then lastly, Care Guide is a system that's developed by National Church Residences, who is one of the SAFE members, but again, we're not endorsing any one of these products. We just want to have a full list here that is geared towards senior service-enriched housing. And then there's some others here that we want to just list that we don't get into as much detail, but are also out there. Aunt Bertha is a great system for referrals. Service Point is another case management system. And then various property management programs are also starting to roll out some resident outcomes modules that you can use within that system. Next slide. And again, you don't need, I think I've kind of hinted at this, but you don't necessarily need a database to track this, to start thinking about resident data or to continue your process of resident data. Excel has a wealth of options. Access is a bit of an older tool, but also has a lot of of capability in there. So I wouldn't let not having a database prevent you from expanding on your data practice and your expanding on resident data. And just highlighting, it's also very important to have a culture that values data. I love this quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So when you're thinking about data planning and the cycle of data, making sure that you're also thinking about the culture in your organization and building a culture that invites peer sharing and fosters data literacy, thinking about making staff, feeling a joint ownership of the data, and that everyone has kind of a stake in making sure the data is accurate and high quality. Next slide. And so lastly, really briefly, these are some tips that I've learned over the years that I think are kind of concrete ways to think about improving your data practice. So, I'm not going to go through each one of these. I'll let you all check this out in the interest of time and leaving space for Q&A here. But these are just some kind of examples that I think might help with your data practice. And you want to take this over?
Yep. Thanks, Nicole. Perfect. So many of you probably saw this in the email. This is and we mentioned this at the beginning. This is the first part of a two-part webinar series. We will you'll get an email, but there will also be a link in the chat that you can go ahead and register. We're having the second part of this webinar series on October 7th, 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. The next webinar is really going to provide a bit of an introduction to a selection of the online data systems that Nicole featured. It's not going to be exhaustive, and it's coming from a practitioner perspective. We have 3 to 4 organizations, practitioners, who are going to talk a little bit about each of the data systems they're using and how it's been valuable to them. They'll also share, they'll be honest about their experience, what has worked well, what the benefits have been, where they've seen challenges. So it's really an opportunity for you all to engage with other peers to hear from them how they've used systems. So we'll be sending out more information. I believe we're definitely going to be featuring organizations that use AASCOnline and Family Metrics, ETO, and Bertha, which is a newer integration that many of them are starting to engage on. So I encourage you to register for that. And we've mentioned it several times. If you guys have not visited the CORES Resource Library, please do so. This recording will be available there. There's also a wealth of other resources, toolkits. Many of the resources we shared today are there. And then more recently, we also had launched a COVID-19 resource page that can be accessed from the CORES homepage with some more specific resources designed to support resident services practitioner in supporting both staff and supporting residents. I'm going to stop there and leave it open for Q&A. Please go ahead and use the chat and the questions box. I know that we had a specific question that had come in earlier.
Yes,
Nicole, maybe you would take a first stab at this one.
There's a question: is there legality around capturing, sharing, certification, or recertification data?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I think about this, I think about the difference between, are we thinking about aggregated data, aggregated statistics at like a property-wide level, or are we thinking about household-specific information? If we're talking about aggregated statistics and you're sharing it within your organization, I wouldn't think there'd be any legal remedies. I mean, it's all within your organization, and it's not at the household level. When you start getting to more household-specific information, you just, I think if it's within the same organization, I don't think you should have any concerns. But that's kind of an additional layer of we want to make sure that you might have some security concerns. Are you sharing in a secure way that you want to be kind of confident that it's not going to get outside the organization somehow. And then the next level is, are you trying to share household specific information outside the organization? And that would definitely, you know, raise some security and privacy concerns that you'd want to think about more. So that's kind of my gut, is that you know, you want to, are we talking kind of what level of data are we talking about, and are we talking about within the organization or external to the organization? I don't know, Alexandra, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I think you covered it. I know that we've talked sort of extensively with our members and others about, especially as more and more houses are looking at health data, you know, questions around HIPAA, and there have been some different workarounds. Sometimes it's, you know, some organizations have conferred with their legal department and gotten some sort of, you know, a sign off or a waiver to share data with partners if they have a data sharing agreement. As you said, it sort of depends on if it's individualized data or if you can aggregate it and remove any kind of identifier so that you're assigning a unique ID so that the person's privacy is protected. But there are certainly, you know, workarounds and solutions for many of those things. But should, you know, if that's something you're looking at, you should be talking to the legal team, probably for your organization. I would also say that we have a couple of, there's a few years old, but some older resources on the CORES resource library around some privacy decision making around data. So I encourage you all, you know, when you go to the resource library, you can filter, and there's a filter there that you can search for privacy protocols and tools. Take a look at those as well. Do we have any other questions? All right, give folks another few minutes, another few seconds if you have a burning question. But I want to say thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you in a couple of weeks at the second part of this webinar. As we shared in the beginning, we will be sending this out. This will be available. And if you have additional questions as you're sort of debriefing and absorbing the information, don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact us at cores@safenet.org with any other questions about content we covered today or about some of the resources we shared. And we look forward to engaging with you soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.